Olivia Kensington thought the quiet woman sitting near the marina was just another lost tourist who didn't belong at Azure Cove Resort. But by sunset, she would realize she had humiliated the wife of the man who could buy the entire coastline without blinking. The late afternoon sun cast golden reflections across the polished marble entrance of Azure Cove Resort, one of the most exclusive oceanfront properties in Southern California. Palm trees swayed gently in the warm coastal breeze, while luxury cars rolled beneath the white stone archway in a steady parade of wealth and status. Men in tailored linen suits carried champagne glasses across the terrace overlooking the marina, and women draped in designer dresses laughed softly beneath oversized sunglasses. Every detail of the resort had been designed to whisper exclusivity. Even the ocean itself seemed quieter there, as though the waves respected money. Vivian Harper stepped through the entrance wearing a simple ivory linen dress and flat brown sandals that had clearly seen better days. Her blonde hair rested loosely against her shoulders, moving gently with the breeze as she carried a worn leather folder close to her chest. At 36, Vivian possessed the kind of calm beauty that didn't demand attention, but in a place like Azure Cove, calmness was often mistaken for weakness. A valet glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to a couple stepping out of a black Bentley convertible. Vivian thanked him politely anyway, though he barely acknowledged her presence. She walked slowly toward the marina terrace, her eyes moving across the harbor filled with luxury yachts gleaming beneath the fading California sun. Somewhere in the distance, gulls circled above the water while jazz music drifted softly from hidden outdoor speakers. To most people, Azure Cove looked like paradise. To Vivian, it looked expensive, fragile, and strangely lonely. She chose a quiet seat near the edge of the marina overlooking the water and carefully opened the folder on her lap. Inside were documents for a marine conservation initiative that had quietly funded ocean cleanup programs across the Pacific coast for nearly 4 years. Very few people knew Vivian herself had built the foundation behind those projects. Fewer still knew her husband had personally invested hundreds of millions into preserving endangered coastal ecosystems. The Harper name carried enormous power in financial circles, but Vivian preferred silence over recognition. She had learned long ago that people often revealed their true character when they believed you had nothing to offer them. Inside the resort ballroom, preparations for the evening's Yacht networking gala were already underway. Staff members rushed between tables covered in white orchids while wealthy investors and executives slowly filled the property ahead of sunset cocktails. Olivia Kensington moved through the lobby with sharp efficiency, her navy blazer perfectly fitted, her blonde hair tied into a flawless low knot. At 42, Olivia had built her reputation on maintaining the resort's elite image at all costs. She noticed imperfections instantly. A crooked centerpiece, a delayed champagne service, a guest wearing the wrong watch. And now, through the glass overlooking the marina, she noticed Vivian. Olivia slowed her pace. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the woman sitting quietly near the waterfront seating area. The simple dress, the inexpensive sandals, the old folder resting on her lap. Nothing about Vivian matched the polished image Azure Cove sold to its billionaire clientele. Olivia crossed the marble floor toward the outdoor terrace, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. Nearby employees straightened immediately as she passed. "Who's the woman by the marina?" Olivia asked one of the servers quietly. The young man glanced toward Vivian. "Not sure, ma'am. She's been sitting there for about 20 minutes. Olivia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "And nobody verified whether she's a registered guest? I assumed maybe she was waiting for someone." Olivia gave a cold smile. "People don't wait at Azure Cove unless they belong here." She stepped outside onto the terrace, the ocean breeze catching the edge of her blazer as she approached Vivian with the polished expression she reserved for difficult situations. Vivian looked up gently as Olivia stopped beside her table. "Good afternoon," Vivian said warmly. "Beautiful place, isn't it?" Olivia returned a smile that never reached her eyes. "It certainly is. Are you staying with us today?" Vivian closed the folder carefully. "I'm actually here regarding tonight's marina event. I was hoping to speak with the event director for a few minutes." Olivia's gaze flicked toward the folder. "And which organization are you representing?" "The Pacific Horizon Foundation." For the briefest second, Olivia searched her memory. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. More importantly, the woman sitting before her simply didn't look like someone attached to a major foundation. I see, Olivia replied smoothly. Do you have an appointment scheduled with our event team? Vivian hesitated politely. Not formally. I was invited to stop by earlier this week. Olivia folded her hands calmly in front of her. Azure Cove hosts very high-profile private events, Ms. Harper. Vivian Harper. Olivia nodded once, though the name meant nothing to her. Ms. Harper, we typically require official guest credentials for marina access during investor weekends. Vivian remained composed. Of course, I completely understand. I only hoped to have a quick conversation before the gala began. Olivia glanced around as several wealthy guests passed nearby. She noticed the subtle looks already drifting toward Vivian's modest appearance. Azure Cove's image mattered more than feelings. It always had. I'm afraid tonight's attendees are private investors and yacht owners, Olivia said carefully, though the condescension beneath her voice had begun to sharpen. This isn't really the type of event people simply wander into. Vivian's expression softened slightly, but she didn't argue. She simply looked back toward the harbor, where the evening light shimmered across the water like liquid gold. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, something enormous was already moving toward Azure Cove. Olivia Kensington had spent 15 years mastering the art of separating people who belonged from people who did not, and as she stood above Vivian Harper beneath the glow of the marina lights, she felt completely certain which category this quiet woman belonged to. The soft jazz music drifting across the terrace suddenly felt colder as Olivia maintained her polished smile. Around them, wealthy guests moved between candlelit cocktail tables overlooking the harbor, their conversations blending with the distant sound of waves brushing against the docks below. Vivian remained seated calmly, her fingers resting lightly atop the worn leather folder in her lap. I apologize if there was confusion, she said gently. I was told someone from the event board would be here before 6. Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying her. And who exactly invited you, Miss Harper? Vivian paused for a moment. I spoke with someone from the development office earlier this week. Olivia's smile tightened almost invisibly. It was vague, unimpressive, the kind of answer she associated with people trying to gain access to places beyond their status. Nearby, 2 women wearing white designer dresses glanced toward the interaction while sipping champagne. One whispered something softly to the other before both looked away with faint amusement. Olivia noticed. And in that moment, protecting the image of Azure Cove became more important than courtesy. Unfortunately, Olivia said smoothly, the Marina Gala tonight is reserved for verified investors, yacht members, and private guests. Vivian nodded politely. I understand. I only hoped for a short conversation regarding marine conservation partnerships. Olivia almost laughed at the phrase. Marine conservation partnerships sounded noble, but in her experience, people who represented serious foundations did not arrive alone carrying old folders and wearing sandals with faded straps. Serious money arrived in black SUVs. Serious money wore tailored suits and Rolex watches. Serious money never looked uncertain. Azure Cove works with organizations at a very high financial level. Olivia replied carefully, though her voice carried a sharper edge now. Perhaps you would be more comfortable contacting public relations through email instead. Vivian slowly closed the folder in her lap. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment either, just a quiet sadness that Olivia mistook for defeat. I see, Vivian said softly. I did not mean to inconvenience anyone. The words should have ended the interaction, but Olivia sensed eyes watching nearby. Important guests, potential investors, and something inside her refused to allow the image of exclusivity to crack, even slightly. Actually, Olivia continued, lowering her voice while maintaining her polished smile. I think it would be best if we escorted you away from the private marina area altogether. Vivian blinked once, surprised. Escorted? This section of the property is reserved for approved guests only. The ocean breeze swept across the terrace as silence briefly settled between them. One of the nearby servers pretended not to listen while arranging champagne glasses on a silver tray. Across the marina, golden harbor lights reflected against rows of luxury yachts resting quietly in the water. Vivian stood slowly from her chair, smoothing the fabric of her simple ivory dress. There is no need for that, she said calmly. I can leave on my own. Olivia gave a small nod, though the satisfaction in her eyes became impossible to hide. Thank you for understanding. As Vivian picked up her folder, one loose paper slipped free and drifted onto the marble floor. A young server bent to pick it up, briefly glancing at the document before freezing for half a second. Across the top of the page sat the logo for Pacific Horizon Foundation beside financial figures large enough to make his eyes widen. Before he could speak, Olivia took the paper smoothly from his hand and returned it to Vivian without looking at it. Have a nice evening, Ms. Harper, she said. Vivian accepted the paper quietly. Then she looked past Olivia toward the darkening horizon beyond the harbor. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly, as though she had noticed something far away that no one else could yet see. You too, Vivian replied softly. I think tonight is going to become unforgettable for everyone. The moment Vivian Harper stepped away from the marina terrace, Olivia Kensington felt a quiet sense of victory settle over the evening like perfume in the air. To Olivia, the situation had been handled perfectly. The elegant atmosphere of Azure Cove remained untouched, the wealthy guests appeared reassured, and the uncomfortable presence near the harbor was finally disappearing from sight. What Olivia did not realize was that arrogance often sounds most confident moments before it collapses. Vivian walked slowly through the resort lobby, the polished marble floors reflecting the golden chandelier light above her. Guests in tailored suits drifted around her carrying crystal glasses, while soft piano music floated from the ballroom entrance. No one noticed the sadness hidden behind Vivian's calm expression. She had spent years helping coastal communities rebuild after storms, funding scholarships for marine biology students, and quietly protecting beaches that wealthy corporations once tried to destroy. Yet somehow, being dismissed because of a simple dress and worn sandals still stung more than she expected. Near the entrance doors, a young valet hurried forward awkwardly. Ma'am, he called softly. Vivian stopped and turned toward him. The young man looked nervous, glancing back toward the lobby to make sure Olivia was nowhere nearby. I think you dropped this earlier. He handed her a silver pen engraved with tiny blue waves. Vivian smiled gently as she accepted it. Thank you. The valet hesitated before speaking again. I saw the papers in your folder by accident. Pacific Horizon Foundation. That is a big organization, right? Vivian lowered her eyes briefly. It helps where it can. The young man nodded slowly. I just thought they should have listened to you. For the first time all evening, genuine warmth appeared in Vivian's expression. Kind people usually notice what others miss, she said quietly. Then she stepped outside into the coastal evening air. Behind her, inside the glowing resort lobby, Olivia was already moving on to more important guests. Where is Mr. Talbot's champagne reservation? She snapped toward an event coordinator. And somebody make sure the harbor lights are fully activated before sunset. Investors noticed details. Staff members rushed. Across the ballroom beneath massive crystal chandeliers, while servers adjusted white linen tables overlooking the marina. Through the towering glass walls, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a darkening orange sky. Azure Cove was preparing for its most important investor gala of the season, and Olivia intended for everything to appear flawless. Then one of the dock's supervisors hurried through the ballroom doors, breathing heavily. Ms. Kensington, he said carefully, there is something approaching the harbor. Olivia barely looked up from her clipboard. There are always boats approaching the harbor. Not like this. Something in his voice made her pause. She followed him toward the marina windows where several guests had already gathered, staring out toward the ocean. At first, Olivia saw only the fading sunlight reflecting across the waves. Then she noticed it. Far beyond the harbor entrance, enormous white lights moved slowly against the darkening horizon. The vessel was still distant, but even from miles away, its scale was impossible to ignore. Conversations throughout the ballroom began fading one by one. A hush slowly spread across the room as more guests drifted toward the windows. Is that a private yacht? Someone whispered. Another guest stepped closer to the glass. That thing is massive. Olivia felt a strange tightness settle in her chest as the yacht drew closer through the evening mist, its glowing exterior lights shimmering across the water like a floating city. She had worked around wealthy people for years, but vessels like this belonged to another level entirely. Then the harbor master entered the ballroom holding a radio against his ear, his face pale. "We just received identification clearance," he announced quietly. "The incoming vessel belongs to Harper Global Holdings." Olivia's confident expression froze for half a second. Around her, several investors exchanged startled glances. One older executive nearly spilled his drink. "Alexander Harper?" he asked sharply. "The Alexander Harper?" Outside, the enormous yacht continued moving silently toward Azure Cove Marina, while somewhere beyond the ballroom windows, Vivian Harper sat alone on a quiet bench overlooking the ocean, watching everything unfold exactly as she knew it would. The moment the name Harper Global Holdings echoed across the ballroom, the atmosphere inside Azure Cove changed completely. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the piano music near the terrace suddenly felt distant beneath the growing tension spreading across the resort. Olivia Kensington stared through the towering marina windows as the massive yacht glided closer through the darkening Pacific waters like something out of another world. Its polished white exterior reflected gold against the ocean, while rows of elegant lights illuminated every deck with quiet power. This was not the kind of vessel celebrities rented for weekends. This was generational wealth floating across the harbor. Around Olivia, wealthy investors began whispering urgently among themselves. "Alexander Harper owns that yacht," one man muttered in disbelief. Another executive lowered his voice. "I heard he has been looking into coastal investment partnerships this year." "If Harper Global chooses Azure Cove," someone whispered, "this place becomes untouchable." Olivia felt her pulse quicken beneath her composed expression. For years, she had worked tirelessly to elevate Azure Cove into one of the most prestigious luxury resorts on the West Coast. A partnership with Alexander Harper could change everything. International recognition, expansion funding, elite media coverage. The entire future of the property could transform overnight. Suddenly, every staff member inside the ballroom moved faster. Servers straightened trays. Event coordinators adjusted centerpieces for the third time. Managers rushed toward the marina entrance, preparing for the arrival of one of the wealthiest men in the country. Olivia immediately took control. "Activate full dock lighting," she ordered sharply. "I want every pathway clear and every staff member in position within 5 minutes." Her heels struck the marble floors rapidly as employees scrambled around her. Outside, guests crowded along the marina terrace, watching the yacht approach with open fascination. Phones appeared discreetly in designer handbags. Some guests whispered excitedly, while others attempted to act unimpressed despite staring toward the harbor every few seconds. The ocean breeze carried the deep hum of the vessel's engines across the water as the yacht slowly aligned with the private docking platform reserved only for the resort's highest-profile visitors. Olivia smoothed her blazer and forced confidence back into her posture. This was her moment. If she handled tonight correctly, Azure Cove's owners would remember it for years. Then the dock's supervisor approached again, his expression uncertain. "Ms. Kensington," he said carefully, "there is something else." Olivia barely looked at him. "What now?" The yacht crew requested one thing before docking clearance. Olivia crossed her arms impatiently, and the supervisor hesitated. They asked whether Ms. Vivian Harper had already arrived on the property. For a single second, Olivia stopped breathing. The sounds of the ballroom seemed to fade beneath the sudden pressure building inside her chest. "What did you say?" she asked quietly. "They specifically asked for Vivian Harper." Olivia's stomach tightened instantly. Nearby, one of the investors overheard the exchange and looked sharply toward her. "Vivian Harper?" he repeated. "As in Alexander Harper's wife?" Another guest turned pale. "The Vivian Harper from Pacific Horizon Foundation?" Olivia's carefully controlled expression flickered. Suddenly, she remembered the foundation logo on the papers. The calm voice. The quiet confidence. The way Vivian never once begged to stay. And worst of all, the way she had looked toward the horizon before leaving. Realization began spreading across Olivia's face with terrifying clarity. Across the marina, the yacht finally came to a smooth stop beside the illuminated dock. Crew members dressed in Navy uniforms moved with perfect precision, while security staff positioned themselves silently along the platform. Then the lower deck doors opened. A hush fell across the terrace so completely that even the waves seemed quieter. Alexander Harper stepped onto the dock wearing a dark navy suit without a tie, his expression calm but unreadable. At 44, he carried himself with the effortless authority of someone accustomed to rooms changing the moment he entered them. Cameras lowered. Conversations stopped. Nobody dared rush toward him. He thanked the captain quietly before looking up toward the glowing resort above the marina. Olivia forced herself to smile as she stepped forward with several executives behind her. "Mr. Harper," she began smoothly, "welcome to Azure Cove. It is truly an honor to host you this evening." Alexander looked at her for only a moment. His face remained completely still. "Where is my wife?" he asked. The question landed across the marina like a wave crashing against glass. "Where is my wife?" Alexander Harper's voice was calm, almost quiet, but the effect it had on the crowd was immediate. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The ocean breeze swept through the terrace while the lights from the yacht reflected across stunned faces frozen beneath the golden glow of Azure Cove Resort. Olivia Kensington felt the blood drain from her face. For the first time that evening, her polished confidence completely disappeared. Around her, investors exchanged nervous glances while several staff members lowered their eyes toward the marble floor. Alexander looked from one face to another, waiting. His expression never changed, but something about his silence felt heavier than anger. The dock's supervisor cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir, we were informed that Ms. Harper visited the property earlier this evening." Alexander's eyes shifted slowly toward Olivia, and Olivia forced a tight smile that barely held together. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." Alexander said nothing. That silence made the pressure worse. Olivia suddenly became painfully aware of every guest watching her, every executive listening nearby, every employee pretending not to stare. "Your wife arrived without formal credentials," Olivia explained carefully. "We were hosting a private investor gala, and security protocols required us to verify guests before granting marina access." Alexander's gaze remained fixed on her. "Did she tell you who she was?" Olivia hesitated. "She mentioned the Pacific Horizon Foundation." A ripple spread quietly through the crowd again. Several guests recognized the organization immediately now. Pacific Horizon Foundation had funded ocean conservation projects, hurricane recovery programs, and marine education grants throughout the country. Its annual charity gala alone attracted politicians, celebrities, and major investors every year. Olivia swallowed hard. "At the time," she continued carefully, "we were unaware of her connection to your family." Alexander finally stepped forward. The polished dock lights reflected against the dark water behind him, while yacht crew members stood motionless nearby. "My wife should not need my last name to be treated with respect," he said quietly. The entire marina fell silent. One of the older investors looked visibly uncomfortable. Another slowly removed his glasses, staring toward Olivia with disbelief. Somewhere in the distance, silverware clinked faintly from the ballroom before even those sounds faded beneath the tension spreading through the resort. Olivia's voice became smaller now. "Mr. Harper, I assure you we intended no disrespect." Alexander looked toward the glowing resort towering above the marina. "Then why was she escorted off the property?" Nobody answered. The room went completely still. Olivia's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of every eye turning toward her now. For years, she had mastered social situations, controlled conversations, shaped appearances. But this moment could not be managed, because the truth sounded ugly when spoken out loud. "I believed," Olivia admitted quietly, "that she was not an appropriate guest for the event." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Based on what?" Olivia opened her mouth, but nothing came out immediately. She could not very well say the truth in front of everyone. "Based on sandals. Based on simplicity. Based on the absence of visible wealth. Based on the fact that Vivian Harper looked kind instead of powerful." Across the terrace, whispers spread among the guests. One woman shook her head slowly while another looked genuinely embarrassed. The illusion of luxury suddenly felt much uglier beneath the marina lights. Then movement near the lower harbor entrance caught everyone's attention. Heads turned simultaneously toward the pathway leading beside the docks. Vivian Harper was walking quietly toward the marina. She had changed into a simple ivory evening dress that moved softly in the ocean breeze, her silver hair clip catching the golden harbor lights as she approached. She carried herself exactly the same way she had earlier that afternoon. Calm, graceful, unshaken. But now the crowd looked at her differently. Investors stepped aside instinctively as she passed. Conversations disappeared completely. The same people who had barely noticed her hours earlier now watched in silence, as though royalty had entered the harbor. Olivia stood frozen near the dock entrance while Vivian approached Alexander. He looked at her immediately, concern replacing the cold restraint in his expression. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Vivian gave a small nod. "I am now." Alexander gently took her hand. No dramatic display. No performance. Just quiet loyalty beneath the marina lights. And somehow, that simple gesture made Olivia feel even smaller. The silence surrounding Vivian Harper at that moment felt heavier than the ocean itself. Guests who had laughed quietly hours earlier now stood frozen beneath the glowing marina lights, watching the woman they dismissed become the center of attention without raising her voice even once. The Pacific breeze moved gently through Vivian's hair as Alexander kept hold of her hand, his expression calm but unreadable. Around them, Azure Cove no longer felt untouchable. The illusion of superiority that once floated so comfortably through the resort had started cracking beneath the weight of public humiliation. Olivia Kensington struggled to steady herself. "Mrs. Harper," she began carefully, forcing composure back into her voice. "I sincerely apologize if there was any misunderstanding this evening." Vivian looked at her quietly. Not angry, not triumphant. Somehow that made the moment even harder for Olivia to endure. "You were very clear earlier," Vivian replied softly. Several investors nearby lowered their eyes immediately. The memory of Olivia asking whether Vivian belonged there suddenly sounded far uglier now that everyone understood who she truly was. One older executive cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Harper," he said cautiously, "Pacific Horizon Foundation has done extraordinary work along the Gulf Coast. My company actually contributed to one of your hurricane recovery grants last year." Vivian smiled politely. "That was very kind of you." Olivia blinked in surprise. There was no bitterness in Vivian's voice. No attempt to embarrass anyone. She spoke to the executive with the same warmth she had shown the valet outside earlier that evening. And somehow, that grace only magnified Olivia's own behavior. Alexander finally looked toward the resort itself, his eyes moving across the marina terrace, the ballroom windows, the luxury branding displayed proudly across every illuminated wall. "Interesting place," he said quietly. "Very beautiful." Olivia straightened slightly, desperate to recover control of the evening. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. We pride ourselves on delivering an exceptional luxury experience." Alexander nodded once. "I can see that." His tone revealed nothing. That frightened Olivia more than anger would have. One of the resort owners hurried down the marina stairs at that moment, sweating beneath his expensive gray suit despite the cool evening air. Richard Lawson had spent years trying to secure access to investors connected to Harper Global Holdings. The moment he heard Alexander Harper's name, he had abandoned the ballroom entirely. "Mr. Harper," Richard said breathlessly as he approached, "this is truly an incredible honor. We had no idea your wife would be visiting tonight." Alexander looked at him calmly. "That seems to be the problem." Richard's smile faltered instantly. Around them, cameras from invited media teams quietly lowered. Nobody wanted to document what this evening had suddenly become. Olivia stepped forward again, desperation beginning to slip through her polished professionalism. "Mrs. Harper, perhaps we could start over. I would be honored to personally host you both for dinner tonight. The chef can prepare anything you wish." Vivian glanced briefly toward the ocean. The giant yacht lights shimmered across the dark water behind her, while soft harbor music drifted faintly through the air. "That is thoughtful," she said gently. "But kindness offered after status is revealed feels very different from kindness offered freely." The words struck the marina harder than shouting ever could. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even Richard Lawson closed his eyes briefly as embarrassment settled across his face. Olivia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because deep down, she knew Vivian was right. Earlier that evening, she had not seen a woman. She had seen clothing, simplicity, quietness, and she had mistaken all of it for insignificance. Alexander slowly reached into his suit jacket and removed a thin black folder. He handed it calmly to Richard Lawson. "Before tonight," he said quietly, "Harper Global Holdings was considering a $75 million sustainability partnership with Azure Cove Resort. Richard's eyes widened instantly. Several nearby investors looked stunned. Olivia's breathing stopped completely. Alexander's expression never changed. My wife wanted to evaluate whether this property shared the same values as Pacific Horizon Foundation before we finalized discussions. Richard looked down at the folder in horror while the marina fell into absolute silence. Then Alexander added the sentence that shattered whatever remained of Olivia's confidence. After tonight, he said quietly, we no longer believe this resort represents the kind of dignity we invest in. The marina remained completely silent after Alexander Harper's words settled over Azure Cove like a storm cloud that nobody could escape. $75 million. The number alone echoed through the minds of every executive, investor, and staff member standing beneath the harbor lights. But it was not only the money that shook them. It was the realization that the entire opportunity had disappeared because one quiet woman in simple sandals had been judged unworthy before anyone bothered to see who she truly was. Richard Lawson stared at the black folder in his trembling hands as though it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. Inside were partnership proposals, expansion blueprints, environmental investment agreements, and preliminary contracts that would have transformed Azure Cove into one of the most prestigious sustainable resorts in the country. And now, all of it meant nothing. Olivia Kensington stood motionless beside him, her carefully polished image unraveling more with every passing second. The same guests she once impressed now avoided looking directly at her. Some whispered quietly behind champagne glasses, while others stared openly with disappointment. The marble terrace that once felt elegant now felt painfully exposed. Vivian Harper noticed all of it. Yet somehow, her expression remained soft. She looked toward the glowing ballroom windows where staff members stood frozen behind the glass, unsure whether to continue serving drinks or disappear entirely. Then her eyes settled briefly on the young valet near the entrance, the only employee who had shown her kindness earlier that evening. He immediately lowered his gaze, embarrassed by everything he had witnessed. Vivian gently squeezed Alexander's hand before stepping forward slightly. I do not enjoy seeing people humiliated, she said quietly. Olivia looked up quickly, surprise flickering across her face. Vivian's voice carried calmly through the marina air. I came here tonight because Pacific Horizon wanted to support businesses willing to protect the coastline responsibly. This was never only about money. Richard Lawson swallowed hard. Mrs. Harper, please believe me when I say Azure Cove values every guest. Vivian turned toward him with quiet grace. No, she replied softly. Azure Cove values appearances. There is a difference. The words landed like glass breaking in slow motion. Nobody interrupted because nobody could honestly deny it. The resort had spent years building an image of luxury so carefully polished that kindness itself had become conditional. Wealth was welcomed. Simplicity was questioned. And dignity depended entirely on presentation. Olivia's eyes began to glisten beneath the marina lights. Mrs. Harper, she whispered, I made a terrible mistake. Vivian studied her silently for a moment. The ocean breeze moved gently through the harbor while distant yacht lights shimmered against the dark water beyond them. You did not insult me because you knew me, Vivian said softly. You insulted me because you thought I was ordinary. Olivia lowered her head immediately. Around them, several guests shifted uncomfortably as the truth settled deeper into the evening air. Alexander remained silent beside his wife, allowing her words to carry the weight of the moment. He understood something most powerful people never learned. Real dignity did not need volume. It needed truth. One of the investors finally stepped forward from the crowd, an older woman in a silver evening dress who had quietly observed everything from the beginning. Mrs. Harper, she said carefully, for what it is worth. Many of us are embarrassed by what happened tonight. Vivian gave a small appreciative nod. Thank you. The woman glanced toward Olivia before speaking again. People forget that character usually arrives dressed very simply. Another hush fell across the terrace. Even Olivia closed her eyes briefly at those words. Somewhere behind the marina, soft music from the ballroom continued playing for guests who no longer felt much like celebrating. The glamour of the evening had faded completely beneath the uncomfortable exposure of truth. Then Alexander checked the time on his watch before turning gently toward Vivian. The tide changes in 20 minutes, he said quietly. Vivian smiled faintly. Then we should not keep the crew waiting. Together, they began walking back toward the yacht while the crowd instinctively moved aside once again. Nobody stopped them. Nobody dared. Because at that moment, every person standing at Azure Cove understood the same painful lesson. The most powerful woman at the resort had never been the one managing appearances. It had been the quiet woman everyone failed to see. As Vivian and Alexander Harper walked slowly toward the illuminated yacht, the crowd at Azure Cove remained frozen in silence, watching the couple disappear across the private marina dock beneath rows of golden harbor lights. Nobody returned to their conversations. Nobody laughed anymore. The glamorous investor gala that had once felt so important now seemed hollow beside the quiet dignity of the woman they had failed to recognize. The ocean waves rolled gently against the dock, while soft music drifted awkwardly from the ballroom behind them, sounding almost out of place now. Richard Lawson stood motionless near the terrace railing, still clutching the black partnership folder in his hands like evidence of a disaster he could not undo. Beside him, Olivia Kensington looked physically smaller than she had earlier that evening. The confidence that once defined her posture had vanished completely, replaced by the heavy realization that one moment of arrogance had just cost the resort more than money. It had exposed the kind of culture Azure Cove had quietly become. Across the marina, crew members lowered the yacht's boarding platform as Vivian and Alexander approached. The vessel glowed against the dark Pacific waters like a floating city of glass and silver light. Yet despite all its luxury, it was the calmness between the couple that drew the most attention. No dramatic speeches. No revenge. No attempt to humiliate anyone publicly. That restraint somehow made the lesson feel even more devastating. Before stepping aboard, Vivian paused and turned back toward the resort one final time. The evening breeze moved softly through her ivory dress while the marina lights reflected in her eyes. Olivia instinctively stepped forward from the crowd. "Mrs. Harper," she called quietly. Vivian stopped. The entire terrace watched as Olivia descended the dock steps slowly, no longer looking like the untouchable manager who controlled every room she entered. She looked human now, nervous, ashamed. "I know an apology cannot erase what happened tonight," Olivia said carefully, her voice trembling slightly beneath the sound of the waves. "But I truly am sorry." Vivian studied her silently for a moment. Then she glanced toward the resort itself, where employees still stood behind the ballroom windows pretending to continue working while secretly watching the marina. "Do you know what the saddest part is?" Vivian asked softly. Olivia swallowed hard. "What?" Vivian looked back at her gently. "You were not cruel because you hated me. You were cruel because you thought nobody important would care." The words hit harder than anything else spoken that night. Olivia's eyes lowered immediately, because deep down, she knew it was true. If Vivian had remained an ordinary woman with no famous husband, no foundation, and no yacht approaching the harbor, the humiliation would have continued without guilt. The kindness only arrived after status appeared. Alexander remained beside the boarding platform quietly, allowing Vivian to speak uninterrupted. He understood that this moment no longer belonged to business negotiations or financial losses. It belonged to truth. Richard Lawson finally stepped forward as well. "Mrs. Harper," he said carefully, "if there is anything we can do to repair this situation," Vivian offered a faint, almost sad smile. "Respect cannot be repaired through luxury gestures," she replied softly. "It has to exist before the money arrives." The marina fell silent again. Even the investors standing nearby seemed unable to look directly at her now, because every person there understood exactly what she meant. Azure Cove had spent millions creating beauty, exclusivity, and prestige, yet somehow forgot the simplest thing of all: how to treat a quiet stranger with dignity. Vivian finally stepped onto the boarding platform beside Alexander. Crew members moved respectfully around them while the yacht lights shimmered across the dark ocean water. Then, just before disappearing onto the main deck, Vivian turned back one final time. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I hope someday this place becomes as beautiful on the inside as it looks from the ocean." Nobody answered. The room had gone completely silent again. Slowly, the yacht engines began humming deeper against the harbor as the vessel prepared to leave Azure Cove behind. And standing beneath the fading marina lights, Olivia Kensington realized something she would remember for the rest of her life. Wealth impresses people for a moment, But dignity reveals who they truly are. The massive yacht moved slowly away from Azure Cove Marina beneath the sky. Painted deep navy and gold, its shimmering lights reflecting across the Pacific like drifting stars on black water. Guests remained frozen along the terrace long after the vessel began disappearing into the distance. Nobody seemed eager to return to the ballroom anymore. The laughter, the music, the polished glamour that once defined the evening had all faded beneath the uncomfortable truth Vivian Harper left behind. Somewhere in the silence between the crashing waves and the empty champagne glasses, an entire resort had been forced to confront what it truly valued. Olivia Kensington stood alone near the marina railing as the ocean breeze swept through the harbor. For the first time in years, she no longer cared about appearances. The designer guests surrounding her suddenly looked smaller somehow. Fragile, temporary. The resort itself, once so impressive beneath its glowing chandeliers and marble floors, now felt strangely hollow. Earlier that evening, she had believed luxury meant exclusivity. She believed power belonged to people who arrived loudly, dressed perfectly, surrounded by visible wealth. But Vivian Harper had arrived quietly carrying nothing except dignity, and somehow that had proven more powerful than every yacht, investor, and diamond watch combined. Richard Lawson loosened his tie beside her and stared out toward the dark horizon where the yacht lights slowly disappeared into the night. $75 million, he murmured quietly, still unable to fully process what had happened. Olivia closed her eyes briefly. It was never really about the money. Richard looked at her in surprise. Olivia swallowed hard before continuing. That is the worst part. Across the ballroom, guests slowly began gathering their belongings in awkward silence. Some avoided eye contact entirely, while others whispered quietly about the evening that would likely spread through elite business circles by morning. Azure Cove would recover financially eventually. Resorts always did. But reputations built on superficial judgment were far harder to repair. Near the entrance doors, the young valet who had helped Vivian earlier stood quietly watching the ocean. One of the older investors approached him unexpectedly. "You were kind to her before anyone else," the woman said softly. The valet looked embarrassed. "She seemed nice." The investor smiled faintly. Character usually recognizes character. The young man glanced back toward the harbor lights reflecting against the empty marina. Somewhere out there, the woman everyone overlooked was already disappearing into the night without bitterness, without revenge, and without needing anyone's approval. That realization lingered heavily across the resort. Vivian Harper could have humiliated them publicly. She could have demanded firings, shouted in anger, or used her wealth to destroy reputations in front of the entire investor gala. Instead, she chose restraint. And somehow that quiet grace exposed everyone more completely than rage ever could. Hours later, after most guests had finally left, Olivia remained alone inside the now silent ballroom. The chandeliers still glowed overhead, casting golden reflections across rows of untouched champagne glasses and polished marble floors. Earlier, she had walked through this same room believing she controlled who belonged there. Now she understood how blind she had been. She thought about Vivian sitting quietly beside the marina in simple sandals while everyone around her searched desperately for status signals instead of humanity. Olivia slowly approached the giant ballroom windows overlooking the dark ocean. Far away on the horizon, one faint cluster of lights still shimmered against the water before finally vanishing into the night completely. A strange sadness settled over her then, because deep down she realized something painful. People like Vivian Harper only crossed your path once in a lifetime, and whether they left behind respect or regret depended entirely on how you treated them before you knew their value. The ocean outside continued rolling endlessly against the shore, unchanged by wealth, titles, or appearances. Waves crashed softly beneath the cliffs while the wind carried salt through the empty marina. And somewhere beyond the darkness, Vivian and Alexander Harper sailed quietly beneath the stars, leaving Azure Cove behind. With a lesson no amount of money could buy. Because in the end, the world does not remember who looked rich in the room. It remembers who showed dignity when nobody thought they mattered.